Hello, Dawn Moore, Allegiance Title Company. Today I'm going to discuss the addendum for sale of other property and an issue that came up this week. A buyer who had a sale of other property contingency on his purchase needed to extend his closing by 1 week because the sale of his property needed an extension by 1 week. The seller demanded a deposit of additional earnest money in exchange for this extension, and the buyer became angry and refused. The buyer argued that the seller was being arbitrary. After all, the transaction was going to close. The buyer's agent called me to discuss the next steps. I suggested first that if she's going to have to extend the closing date on the contract, she probably also needs to extend the contingency date. Generally, the contingency date is the same date as the closing date because, after all, you need the proceeds on closing and not before. So, if she's extending the closing date, she needs to extend the contingency date. Then, when we looked at the contingency date and the need to extend, we discussed the fact that if the contingency date was not extended, the buyer was faced with either termination of the contract or having to waive the contingency by giving notice to seller and depositing additional earnest money. Under this particular contract, the buyer, to waive the contingency, had to deposit double the amount that the seller was requesting for extension of the closing date. The agent and I discussed the fact that maybe if we explain this to the buyer would be more willing to deposit the additional amount the seller demanded in exchange for an extension of the closing date and the contingency date. Please remember that if the contingency under the sale of other property is not satisfied or waived by the date specified in that addendum, then that contract terminates. It goes on in that same addendum to say time is of the essence. So if that date comes and goes without it being satisfied or the buyer waiving the contingency, the buyer stands to lose that contract. Bottom line, when you have a contingency contract and you need to extend the closing, don't forget to extend the contingency date. I hope this tip is of value to you. Allegiance Title is your resource for results, and I look forward to seeing you at the closing table. Thank you.